Hello and welcome to the Supernatural Track here at Continual. I'm your host, Gail C. Martin, and tonight we are talking about Henry, John, and Dean, The Price of Obsession. And let's throw Sam in there too, because he certainly got part of the ride as well. But before we launch into that, let's let our wonderful panelists introduce themselves, starting with Kristin.
Hi, my name is Kristin Jackson. I'm a graphic designer and I work a lot in the film industry. I've been watching Supernatural since the season one and the show premiered, and I'm very interested in talking about the subject tonight.
Okay, Beth.
Hey, I'm Beth Dolgner. I write paranormal cozy mysteries and romantic urban fantasy. So I'm sort of more on the Scooby-Doo side of the spooky stuff when it comes to how scary it is.
Elektra.
I'm Elektra Hammond. I'm a writer and an editor, and I've been watching since that very first episode aired.
And I'm Gail Z. Martin and Morgan Bryce. As Gail, I write epic and urban fantasy. As Morgan, I write urban fantasy, male paranormal romance. But all my modern day worlds are ones that Sam and Dean could walk into and feel right at home. And yes, I am wearing a Scooby Natural sweatshirt. I fell in love with the series halfway through season 11, binge watched 11 seasons for the start of season 12, went down the rabbit hole, and I have not come up since, and really am not trying to. So, Henry, John, Dean, and Sam, we get to see across generations what the obsession with the paranormal is. We understand from the get-go what John's motivation is and how he instills that into Sam and Dean. But Henry's is a bit more of a mystery. We get that the Winchester family is a legacy with the men of letters, but we don't really get a lot on Henry's backstory. Let's start off by speculating. If he didn't have his wife burned to death on the ceiling like John, what do you think got Henry into this, and why did he become so deep into it that he made it into the men of letters? Kristin?
Oh, geez. I'm wondering if it, considering if the men of letters was an inherited sort of occupation, that it was a combination of him for, just doing the family business, and also the age, the era that he was in. Everything was big causes, big good versus evil, lots of things going on in that World War II generation. So I think he might have just felt the spirit of the greatest generation, that they were motivated to do big heroic things and take on evil and fight with whatever tools he had. So that's probably part of his motivation, was just personality and generation, and combined with the legacy.
So some people took on the communists and Henry went after the supernatural. Certainly could have happened that way. Beth?
Well, I think that obsession certainly runs in that family. Everybody, even Mary, can be very single-minded when she's going after something. And I think that's a part of it. And I mean, I would imagine that if you've had some sort of dangerous supernatural encounter, that could be a really good motivator to want to know what else is out there in the world and how you can fight it. And I mean, I think it's one of those things where just, one experience could probably shape the rest of your life. Kind of like you pull back that curtain and see how much terrible, scary stuff there is out there. And that would certainly give, someone like him a chance to, or a desire to go after it and try to change it.
Okay, Elektra.
Well, in my headcanon, Henry was definitely a legacy for the men of letters. The way that he immediately, when he had to escape, went for something, headed for family, for his blood descendants. And he just assumed that John would be a man of letters because he was a legacy. Just added that in my head that he'd been a legacy and had gotten this from his father, who'd gotten it from his father, that this was a thing in the family. And just that raw assumption that John would be a man of letters and would know what to do to help him. And okay, you're my grandsons, you must be men of letters. And it was just that feeling there that this was just something the family did. I mean, back then, you joined a lodge. I mean, that was just a thing. I was going into the Masonic Lodge. I belonged to one of the kid groups. I never quite made it into Eastern Star because mostly geography issues, but I was a member for a couple of years, and my mother was an Eastern Star and my dad was a Mason going back to the 50s.
Mhm.
Family things.
Mhm.
It's what you do.
Yeah, both of my grandfathers who were of that era were Masons, and one of my grandmothers was Eastern Star. Kind of fell off after that with my parents' generation, but I have to laugh thinking of the men of letters as being kind of paranormal Masons.
That's exactly what they are.
But that has, when you get to the lodge and the secret rituals and there's a lot of truth to that. And it does make you wonder, headcanon wise, and I don't think I've seen this broached in even fan fiction of, well, what was that inciting incident? Did somebody rescue someone in the Winchester family from something supernatural and then say, well, you can pay this forward if you join us, this is what we do? Or did someone seek him out because they saw the kind of qualities that would make a good hunter? Or
They
not just
weren't hunted.
the academic side of understanding the supernatural. I think that leaves, we have a lot that is left to our imagination, and it's kind of fun to think about how far back did this go? And what was that inciting incident? Someone saying, hey, you kind of have what it takes. You might want to join this group over here, as opposed to getting rescued or out of, running into somebody in the middle of something and going, how can I pay this forward? So Henry,
Who your
Go ahead.
mates were at college, maybe.
Mhm.
The way, your fraternity brothers make those connections for you in business. Maybe they also, if you belong to the right secret society in college. Sorry, I lived right below a secret society when I was my freshman year, and I used to see people go up there for rituals. Maybe if you belong to the right secret society and they think you're material, they send you to the men of letters.
That's certainly reasonable. And again, given that era and how popular those kind of organizations were, it kind of seems like in that era you had to belong to a whole host of things just kind of be normal. And so yeah, that's an interesting theory.
And
But now we
depending on
know.
how, well,
Go ahead.
depending on how far back the Winchester line went, they could have been, conceivably connected to the British men of letters if it went back that far.
Oh,
Mhm.
I'm already picturing Victorian supernatural. I want to hear those stories.
Steampunk supernatural.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Somebody needs to write those, but scrape the serial numbers off and publish them.
I do have a series that is a lot like Wild Wild West if they were hunting monsters. So not exactly supernatural, but yeah, you can see it from here. Yeah, I think that is also a possibility, is that it went back much further than Henry, and that you had at the time that the country was being settled, you have colonists coming over, you have They might be familiar with the legends and lore and the creatures where they came from, but this is a whole new continent. And for the most part, settlers didn't do a great job of listening to the people who were already here. If they tried to tell them, really seriously, don't go into that mountain. It's not a good idea. Oh, sure, it's a pretty mountain. I'm gonna, told you. You know, don't go into those caves. People didn't listen real well. But thinking back to the episode with Samuel Colt, certainly could have been men of letters around at that time. And they could have split off from the British men of letters. They could have been affiliated for a while and then gone their separate ways. There's a lot of interesting speculation there on, and now that we know that it comes down through the Campbell line as well on Mary's side, not so much the men of letters, but the hunting and the interaction with the supernatural. It does seem like the wheels of fate were in motion very, very early on.
Maybe Wells was a man of letters. I
H.G.
could
Wells.
definitely see that.
Mhm. Well, I mean, sure, you can also imagine that any of the speculative writers of the day were just taking what they did at work and spinning it into things that, oh, they'll never believe this is real. We'll just make it fiction. And yeah, could definitely see that being the case with the spec fic authors of the time. But now you've really got me, and now I'm going to have to go out and look and see if anybody's written those sort of stories about the Winchester men of letters back in the day. If you can think of it, I'm sure there are stories out there.
Letters aren't that popular with everybody.
True.
I mean, I love them, but I don't know if everybody else gives them lots of love.
So we've got Henry, who disappears on a case and never comes home. So now we know that John grew up without a father, no explanation of where dad went. Did his mother know about the men of letters? Was she supportive if she did know? Maybe she didn't tell John because she didn't want him following in his father's footsteps, only for him to end up on the other side of it later. The supernatural kind of loves its fate. You can try all you want to change your path, but there's a big element of fate here. What do you think with how it went down with Henry and Henry to John? Kristin?
Yeah, I can see that when the father disappears and you have a small kid, you have to kind of explain things in a way that they would understand, saying that your father was a man of letters and a person of destiny, and he's out there fighting monsters. That might be a lot to handle, because then, of course, the kid is immediately going to think dad was eaten by a monster, and that's why I didn't come home. On the other hand would be, if he was a part of a secret society, and back in that time, you know, the men did their thing over here, and women did their thing, and they had their knitting circles and tea parties or whatever housewives did back then, you know, or you know, stuff for the war effort or whatever. It was kind of like separate lives in a lot of ways, the men group and the women group, and they didn't really connect. So for all she knew, he might have just ran away and just never came home. So I guess we're just kind of left to just speculate as to why John was not told anything about his dad, other than the fact that he was just there and then he was gone, and thought that something that he did had sparked that. Didn't my dad love me? Type of thing. So it kind of left a deep scar on John, which then ended up getting transferred to his sons, and it just kept rolling downhill.
Yeah, talk about legacies. Yeah, it's kind of an interesting question about secrecy, isn't it? Because would your spouse No. Would you be allowed to tell them? Would you ever be able to tell your children? And if so, at what age could you tell your children? I mean, like Kristin said, that's not an easy subject to broach. Like, hey, there's monsters and I fight them. And, but at the same time, how do you explain when you are gone for 5 days and come home beat up, so again, I think that's one of those things that sort of secret society lore that you could really explore. I mean, I really want to go find, like you, but now I want to go find fan fiction and see if anybody's tackled some of these. Has anybody sort of made some rules or thought about what it would have been like? Because certainly having somebody in your close family who is doing those kind of things and not knowing what they did or why they were doing it, I think is just a recipe for a lot of conflict and mistrust.
Mm-hmm. Elektra?
His wife knew at least that he was going to lodge night, at the very least. I don't know if she may have just assumed it was like all the other lodges, the Moose Lodge, the Masons, and that, she didn't know whether they were doing secret rites or whether they were playing cards. It was just, he was going off to play with his friends. Have a nice time, dear. And I don't know that she wanted to know more about what he was doing. He just had his night when he went and went off with his friends, and that was okay. That was what men did back then. They had their time, and he kissed her goodbye, and I'll be back in a couple of hours. And one time he didn't come back. But I don't know that, Men of Letters is so much weirder than Hunters. I go hunt monsters. I go learn about monsters. And they were taught some basic spells, but until he got initiated, he didn't really even know a whole lot about what was going on with the Men of Letters. He was still fairly low level. And if she knew where they were meeting, she may have assumed something happened to him, because the fire there was in the newspaper. But if not, maybe if she went to the police, they would have told her husband ran off because of the time period. So we just don't know what happened, but he did tell John he was going to come home.
Well, and you read these stories about people who find out decades later that their spouse or their parent was actually a spy or a double agent. And it takes a certain personality to keep that sort of secret from your nearest and dearest. But apparently some people do for many different motivations. And I can imagine Henry believing this to be a noble cause, just like, working on behalf of your, king and country, and feeling that it justified the silence because he was working for the greater good. Now, in hindsight, maybe not the best decision. Pardon me. But I think it is entirely possible that, wasn't her name Millie? That Millie didn't know the truth about what Henry was really doing. The glimpse we get of her seems like a strong person. She takes over running the car garage or somehow ends up being a mechanic, which then, that skill transfers down the line. Pardon me. So she was a very strong person, but it is an interesting question about whether or not she ever knew. And then did she make a decision not to tell John because she didn't want the same thing to happen to him that happened to his father? Or did she truly just not know? But that leaves John growing up without a father from a fairly young age, in a household that probably struggled, at least at times, for money. And the thing that makes me wonder is if he was a legacy, then there could be supernatural entities out there that knew, hey, this Winchester is a legacy, and the bad guys know, but he doesn't know. So was there someone kind of looking out for John after Henry was gone? Did a bang up job of it when it came to, the inciting incident for the whole series. But it does make me wonder, wouldn't that have put him in some degree of danger from the forces of darkness? That here's this guy who's a legacy man of letters, but has none of the protections of it. So if anybody out there writes fan fiction and is taking notes. So then we have John dealing with Sam and Dean and passing on his knowledge and experience kind of haphazardly. And I think this is where Henry might have been more scholarly in his pursuits, but John, we absolutely know, was driven by an obsession for revenge. Let's talk a little bit about how that affected Sam and Dean, because I think it affected them deeply, but somewhat differently as we see the story play out. Kristin?
Yeah, well, John, he also was a Vietnam vet too, so he had his own trauma, followed by more trauma with his wife and his kids, and learning about this entire different level of monsters that the world is dealing with out there. So I guess it just from his personality, his way to deal with it was just to focus completely on the mission. And his revenge is a mission. Raising his boys to protect themselves and keep themselves safe was a mission. And he kind of just pushed humanity aside in this drive to, and this focus and this years of singular obsession with his various missions. So I don't, he just, and of course, Dean being a similar personality, he just absorbed it like a sponge. And if anything, Sam was more like Henry and kind of was the more scholarly side of things. So there'd probably be, that was kind of a conflict set up, waiting to happen. You have the son who's more interested in just, I want to grow up normal. I want normal friends. I want a normal school. I want normal life. And meanwhile, John is just trying to do his best to keep his boys safe and prepare them for this terrible world. And, when all his experiences in life seem to have just been terrible. So it's kind of understandable why he was such a single-minded, very focused and obsessed person.
Beth?
Yeah, I can't imagine how hard it would be growing up with a father who was so obsessed with the supernatural and really obsessed with getting revenge to the point that his children became almost like afterthoughts. They were not the most important thing in John's life in a way. His single-minded mission was more of his important thing in life. And I think, like Kristin said, it's interesting that, both Sam and Dean took very predictable but very different approaches as they got older, whereas one said, I don't want anything to do with this, I want to get out of it. And the other one was very much like, oh, this is what's most important in the world, I'm going to do the same thing. But yeah, I think that would have to have an incredible psychological effect on children to feel like no matter what, your own personal life was not the thing that was most important to your father, but getting revenge for your dead mother. I mean, what a message that sends to these children.
Elektra?
I sometimes wonder what the impetus was for them to have children. I think it might have been Mary's desire to prove that she was leading a normal life and not a hunter, because neither of them seems to have wanted to be parents.
Good point.
I mean, she couldn't cook. She never learned how really.
Winchester surprise.
John couldn't, and they didn't seem equipped to deal. And when he got thrown into the role of, oh, hey, you're a single dad now and you have 2 little kids, he just wasn't equipped. And that whole focus on so much revenge. I need to know what killed my wife and I need to kill it because it took away the one thing that I was focusing on. You know, I loved Mary and that was it. And I think even caring for the kids was just an afterthought because he couldn't drop them off somewhere. I think if he could have found a daycare that would have taken them, 24/7, he would have just left them there.
Well, we know that he did leave them with Bobby for stretches at a time.
And Father Jim.
Yeah,
was it?
Father Jim.
He dropped them off when he could and just went off and did things once he found out about this whole weird supernatural world and that he was trying to catch something. And the more he found out about it, the more he obsessed. He just was not equipped to be a dad.
Mm-hmm.
John Winchester's A+ parenting was just, he just wasn't into the dad thing. He wasn't, I don't know that he was into the revenge thing either, but that was thrust upon him because he couldn't go to the cops and say, hey, yeah, a demon killed my wife and I'd like you to do something about it. So.
And
Because
Mary
of
was
that-
kind of his rock too.
Mm-hmm.
Mary was like the oasis of stability in his life. He's lost his dad. He's been tossed into the middle of, one of the most terrible wars that we could have gone through when it comes to just emotional damage. And he finds Mary, he settles down, and then he gets torn away. So
and
it's
he's
like the
completely
man
unaware that she's been sneaking off every now and again to do a little hunt, just, to keep her hand in.
So
It so reminds me of Helen Mirren's character in Red, who's running a B&B and, putting out flower bouquets. And every now and again, she takes a little bit of an assassination assignment. She runs off and kills somebody just to keep her hand in and make sure that she can still do it. Just in case. It's that same sort of thing. She does a hunt once in a while, just, because she's so stressed up about being stuck in the house with the 2 kids.
Some women join a sewing circle and some people go out and off a couple of vampires. I mean,
Go up to Canada, save a life, come home,
mm-hmm.
and pick up a pie on the way and heat it up and serve it to your family.
Uh-huh.
And that also kind of ties into John's, his conflict with Sam is that he's, it's another loss that his son, who he's tried so hard to keep safe, now wants to leave. And it's another loss in his life. So maybe that was some of the, the conflict, aside from personality, it's just another person who is leaving him.
Well, and
Yeah.
John went to the military right after high school. And Sam wants to go to college, and that's like a totally alien world to John.
Well, Dean has much more of John's personality, but what if Sam reminded John in other ways of Mary? And he lost Mary. And now keeping Sam in sight is almost like protecting Mary. And what do you mean you want to go to California? And you won't be where I can protect you. I can see that maybe not being a conscious reaction of John's, but if Sam with his, being so different from Dean and John was a reminder of Mary, that certainly could have influenced John's reactions to many of the things Sam did.
And could have reminded him of what his childhood memory of his father.
Mm-hmm.
That, a educated, well-spoken, sort of a person who was more like Sam than Sam was to the other 2. So it could have had some just emotional faint
Yeah,
memory
his whole
from
life was
childhood.
marked by loss. Yeah.
Mhm.
I think the closest I can come to understanding John's obsession is I had an uncle who was infantry in World War II and saw a lot of combat. He got frozen feet at the Battle of the Bulge. I mean, he was out there in the trenches, literally. And he came home with what was certainly undiagnosed PTSD that marked the rest of his life. You know, they didn't really label this stuff back then. And that trauma led him into being terrified about the communists coming. The communists were going to take over any minute now. They're, you know, it's all going to happen. And they were his demons. John's demons, this was my uncle's demons, was the commies are coming over the next hill. Got to watch for them everywhere. And he raised two kids who were about 10 years older than I was. One of them escaped. She left, never came home. The other one had some health conditions that he couldn't do that. And I remember him telling me when he was in his late 20s, don't judge me. I have to go along with it because I can't leave. And I think about that when I think about John's obsession and passing it on to the children is some can leave and others can't. Now, Dean wasn't ill, but he may have just been too emotionally connected to John to be able to leave. Part of Dean raising Sam is that Sam was healthier emotionally. Sam had more of a father figure than John was to Dean. And so part of being healthy was he could leave. But I think about that when I think about the roots of John's trauma and coming out of the war and coming out with a brand new enemy to fight. And then my cousin's reaction, that's not exactly, hey, we hunt monsters, but to my uncle, there were monsters behind every couch and tree. So it was eerily similar now that I think of it. Other thoughts, parallels, or insights? Because I think we've gone some cool places here.
Well, Gail, I think you just said something that was interesting, talking about, Dean being healthy, like he could have gotten out, but for whatever reason chose not to. And I think for Dean, he had a relationship with his mother and he remembered her. And so I think he was probably able to look at John's obsession and understand it a little bit better than Sam, because he knew, oh, we're fighting for my mother, this woman that I knew, that I loved, who I have memories of. Whereas to Sam, it was essentially, we're out there hunting down bad things for a total stranger, essentially, because he did not have those memories. And so I think that was probably part of it, is that Dean had that connection to Mary that Sam did not. And so that made it easier for Sam to cut those ties.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, Dean had a cause. He had a cause and a mission too. Whereas Sam was more, he was too young to have known anything. So his only experience is just, this is ridiculous. Why are we doing this? You're beating yourself up. You're getting hurt. You're getting thrown around. We've got monsters coming after us. I know how to defend myself. I'd like to have a normal life like all these other people. Please let me go. And Dean had his cause, and that's why he kept kind of trying to rope Sam back into stuff.
In the first couple of episodes, they made Dean smarter, and then they started to distinguish between them and gave Sam all the smart stuff, all the computer stuff, and made Dean a little bit less computer smart in order to distinguish he needs Sam to do that stuff type thing. I think in that very first episode, they had Dean manipulating the voicemail that they'd gotten from their dad, I think. in that very first episode, and Dean had run it through some software and done some manipulation to it, and it was fairly advanced stuff, and he was talking about it very matter-of-factly. And they stopped having him do things like that because that was Sam's role, was to do all the computer stuff and manipulate sound, and Dean was better with, you know, guns.
Mhm. Well, I think the other piece here is not only John's PTSD from Vietnam and then the woundedness from Mary, but we know from some of the things Dean said that John basically was a functional alcoholic after Mary died. So you've got Dean, who was 4 when this whole thing started, putting his drunk dad to bed and taking care of baby Sammy and trying to figure out where the money was coming from to feed baby Sammy and cleaning up after drunk dad, and hearing his dad probably go on crying jags about losing Mary. We know Dean is a good caregiver, but it certainly was, he didn't have much of a choice from early on because somebody had to do it. And if John was passed out, well, somebody needed to make sure that Dean and Sam ate and that the guy running the hotel didn't find out. And so I think that not only made Dean have to grow up a lot earlier, and nobody should have to deal with those kinds of things, whether they're a child or not, but there was no way for him to escape John's obsession because he had to clean up the mess. Where Sam got buffered from the worst of it, at least until he was old enough to see what was going on, because Dean protected him from it. And so, of course, we find out that Sam can be just as obsessed as any other Winchester. What's the thing that Gabriel tells him? Something about you and sharp objects. And so they all kind of have that trait, but it takes something. There has to be that moment of terrible loss to activate it.
Well, John was a functional alcoholic, but he lost Mary at the same time, virtually, that he finds out about all the monsters in the world, that they all exist. And those two things in combination are enough to just destroy anyone. But Dean grows up and he becomes pretty much a functional alcoholic. I mean, the amount of drinking that he does on screen is just scary. And he's completely functional. So there is that. He learned that from Daddy. He's got an amazing capacity to be able to drink and still shoot straight, if nothing else.
Part of which is learned, but part of which is also genetic. I mean,
Well,
it comes with practice, but
it's practice. I mean,
yeah.
you develop your capacity. You have to drink on a regular basis to be able to drink that much and keep doing stuff.
The quote from Gabriel was, "Let me tell you, whoever said Dean was the dysfunctional one has never seen you with a sharp object in your hands. Holy Full Metal Jacket." From Mystery Spot. So, and we got a glimpse into what Sam was capable of when he was soulless. So, the apple doesn't fall too far from the obsessed tree. Any last thoughts before we, go around and do our wrap up? Kristin?
I don't know. I guess there's a lot to think about when you're thinking about the obsession. Is it nature or nurture? And we've sort of gotten a little bit of both throughout the series. We've seen the different generations, and each generation kind of had its own version of its obsession and their own triggering events, their own sort of background trauma that they each experienced, lots of loss and lots of unhealthy coping skills. So yeah, you're kind of, now I'm wondering how much of it was something that was kind of a And again, that fate thing. We don't know where they started messing around in the Winchester's lineage, at what point that they became the persons who would eventually come together and, kick off the apocalypse.
Mhm.
So, how far back did that go, and what was that influence on this obsession and the loss and everything else?
Mhm.
So, yeah, lots to think about.
Beth?
We all like to pick on John Winchester's A+ parenting, but as Elektra just pointed out, the poor guy had been through a lot of trauma and then discovered that the supernatural world existed at the same time that he watched his wife die this horrific death. So I think if any of us were in his shoes, we probably wouldn't have been very good parents either. So maybe he deserves a little bit of grace. Yeah, I mean, I think it was inevitable that that kind of obsessive behavior and those, as Kristin says, unhealthy coping mechanisms were going to get passed down as a generational thing, because that was so much of the life that Sam and Dean were exposed to.
Mhm. Elektra?
Well, I think everybody in the family had something to obsess over at one point or another, and it certainly is entertaining to watch. I mean, this series wouldn't be nearly so fun if we hadn't gotten to watch John chase after Azazel. So there is that.
What would we have had with well-adjusted Winchesters? Well, and Dean at more than one time said, my father was an obsessed bastard. He was angry at John later. But in Lebanon, the episode with the magic pearl that brought John back in time, or forward in time,
Forward.
we saw a very different side of John with his now adult children and with Mary that Dean had not seen John interact with Mary as an adult. Sam had never seen that he remembered. And I've seen interviews with Jeffrey Dean Morgan, who said that he absolutely believes that despite John's failings as a parent, he loved his boys and did the best he knew how to do to protect them from this horrible reality that was just hidden in the shadows. So, lots to think about. And as I said, if we've got any fan fiction writers out there, you've got some prompts to go on. But before we wrap up, let's tell everybody where people can find you online. Kristin?
I guess I'm mostly on Blue Sky now at AnnieCat68. That's where you
Okay.
can find me.
Beth?
You can find me on my website, bethdolgner.com, and you can find all my links there to my social media.
Okay. Elektra?
I'm Elektra Hammond. You can find anything about me at untilmidnight.com. And later this year, we're going to be pushing an anthology called Permutations, which is new stories in Jack Chalker's Well World for the first time in a couple of decades. So really looking forward to that being released. It'll be launched at this year's Balticon in May.
Awesome. I'm pretty easy to find online at gailzmartin.com, morganbryce.com. If you spell those right, you'll find me on all the social media, and I'm on pretty much all the main ones under one or both of those names. But most of the time, you can find me here at Continual. So thank you so much for being with us tonight. And thanks to all of you for watching and listening. There will be more Supernatural coming up on Continual, so we'll see you online.